Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks for attending this session. I'm really excited to be here in person and tell you about our recent findings on the interaction between acute responses and chronic adaptations of high-intensity interval training in cycling. High-intensity interval training is one of the most frequently researched topics in exercise science, with various systematic reviews and meta-analysis that have been published over the years. Given this huge amount of research, Martin and colleagues even published a meta-review and emphasized the potential effects of high-intensity interval training on health, cardiorespiratory fitness, as well as performance. In the groundbreaking review, Bouchet and Lawson demonstrated the complexity of HIIT sessions, given that a single HIIT session can be described by a total of 10 variables like exercise intensity, recovery duration, number of repetitions, and so on, and many more. So there's a lot of variation that is in interval training. However, recent meta-analyses in this field have predominantly focused on the comparison between traditional long intervals, like 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, with sprint interval training. So, for example, 30 seconds, all-out efforts with a lot of recovery afterwards. So there are a few questions that remain open, like, what about these short interval stacks of logs like 30-30s, 30-15s that have not been included in these reports? How does the inclusion of several exercise modalities like, for example, cycling, rowing, or running affect these findings? And the same applies to the combination of different performance levels from the sedentary up to the elite level. And last but not least, we were highly interested in this connection between acute responses during a session, for example, in the time spent at a certain VO2 max, and the chronic adaptations. We assume that there is an interaction, but we were interested in this, which has not been applied to previous systematic reviews. So what we basically did is we performed a systematic review and searched for articles from 2013 up to the date of the search, and looked for articles that compared at least 2 high-intensity interval training protocols in cycling, and we used Web of Science and PubMed for databases. So we found a lot of articles using this search, and consequently removed all the duplicates, so we had a total of 408 records to be screened. As usual in systematic reviews, a lot of them got excluded, either because they use a rotted model, or, for example, they applied only one high-intensity protocol and compared this to moderate intensity training. So we had a total of 56 articles for retrieving the full text. Fortunately, we got all the full text, so we could check them for eligibility. And in this process, we had to exclude another 25 of them, either because they did not use cycling as an exercise modality, or because the performance level was too low. As a minimum, we aim for performance level 2, which is corresponding to a mean VO2 max of 45. So finally, we included a total of 31 articles in this study, out of which 23 used or emphasized the acute response, and 14 aimed for chronic adaptations. If you take a close look at these numbers and sum them up, you will recognize that a total of 6 articles basically combined these 2 approaches. And given that my time is limited today, I would like to focus on these 6 publications for the rest of this presentation. So if we take a close look at the characteristics of these studies, we see a lot of variation, especially concerning the type of interval sessions applied. So we had short interval sessions, long interval sessions, repeated sprint training, as well as these short interval stacks and blocks that can be seen here. But we see also a lot of variation in the number of applied HIIT sessions, which range from a total of 6 up to 20 HIIT sessions. If we take a look at the acute responses, we see that only one study of these 6 recorded the time spent near VO2 max, whereas a lot of studies indicated the time spent, or the lactate concentration at the end of the session. Who's been at the lactate session knows that lactate is a signal molecule, so it does make sense. And there is a lot of variation in it, so we see mean values of 5 millimolar for the 4 times 60-minute intervals, and readings up to 10 or even 15 for short interval protocols. Chronic adaptations were summarized in terms of improvements in time trial performance, as well as improvements in VO2 max or lactate threshold. Terns and colleagues found that short and long intervals have a similar potential for improving time trial performance, whereas repeated sprint training demonstrated only minor improvements. Seiler and colleagues found that the 8-minute intervals have superior potential for improving VO2 max and lactate threshold when compared to 4 and 60-minute intervals. And Ronstadt and colleagues basically found that the improvement of these short interval stacks and blocks, so the typical, you call them Ronstadt intervals, 3 times 13 times 30 15s, have 3 times the performance potential when compared to 4 times 5-minute traditional long intervals. What should be taken into consideration when comparing these studies is the matching procedure, which can either be time match, work match, power match, effort match, or even isocaloric. And at best, you find studies that combine a few of these studies. And who has been to the talk of Knut Skobbereng, he's done a lot of research on this acute responses in terms of time spent near VO2 max. And we already discussed that, for example, these Ronstadt intervals maybe should be compared to 6 times 5-minute intervals rather than 4. So future studies should avoid having an apples to oranges comparison between protocols. The major limitation of the studies we included is the design, because none of the studies applied a longitudinal crossover design here, which definitely limits our knowledge about high-intensity interval training and cycling. This also applies to all of the articles included, so not only these 6 I've shown you here. So there's definitely a need for more longitudinal interventions with a crossover. What should also be taken into account and maybe explains differences in certain parameters are differences in oxygen kinetics between participants that can definitely affect parameters like time spent above 90% of VO2 max, as well as the warm-up routine that can definitely affect acute responses in the following sessions. Future studies should definitely describe these warm-up routines in more detail and think about having, for example, high-intensity short bursts in the beginning. This does definitely affect the following session. Whereas most of the studies focus primarily on aerobic parameters like VO2 max, studies on the adaptation response of anaerobic parameters in terms of high-intensity training is limited. So parameters like maximum lactate accumulation rate could easily be implemented in future studies and see how the glycolytic component adapts to certain protocols. And last but not least, we have to be aware of inter-individual responsiveness that is related to contextual variables, like, for example, the performance level or the type of high-intensity sessions the participants are used to. So finally, we were actually not able to really have this linkage between acute responses and chronic adaptations with the studies available. So at the end of my presentation, I would like to share some contextual data of how future studies could actually close this knowledge gap. So if future studies, for example, plot the acute responses of the participants in terms of time spent, for example, above 90% VO2 max, in terms of, or in relation to the VO2 max alterations, and indicate the performance level as here illustrated by the bubble radius, we have definitely more possibilities of identifying relationships. For example, if we only take a look at studies B and C, we would tend to see a linear relationship between these variables. However, studies like study A with the red bubbles and the participants with lower performance level, this would definitely interfere with this relationship. And plotting these data like this, similar ways that Patrick Wall showed this in an earlier talk, we had definitely more ideas about this topic. So there's definitely a lot of work to do, and especially hard work if this should be applied in a crossover. and this stresses for me the need for more exchange and collaboration between labs. So I'd like to close my presentation with a quote of Kenneth Wilson, who said that the hardest problems of pure and applied science can only be solved by the open collaboration of the worldwide scientific community, and being here in Seville is definitely a good place to start. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Oliver. Any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation, really interesting. How would you distribute like long interval sessions and short duration interval sessions into a season, for example? Because even if you show that short interval training improve performance compared to a long interval session, I don't see you athletes doing this the whole season, doing only short duration interval sessions. So how would you distribute like long duration interval sessions with short duration interval sessions?
Thank you very much for the very interesting question. I cannot answer these questions by the data we collected, but it's rather practical answering. So usually you should consider what are the performance times or the type of performance that the athletes are faced to. For example, mountain bike athletes have a lot of variation in their competitions, so I would rather tend towards short intervals shortly before the competition, because it's probably has more transfer to the competition. For time trialists, I would rather say that the interval length should be increased, for example, having 8 or even 16-minute intervals rather towards the performance period. But at best, I guess you have a mixture between the two. But this is just some practical knowledge, and there's a lot of work to do to get this. But having short intervals and long intervals in the combination maybe is a better tool. Thanks. Thank you. And this can definitely be applied in Swift as well.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Oliver, for a great presentation. I have a question from the practicability perspective. There was one slide where you just mentioned the 90% above VO2 max, and I just asked myself, from a coaching perspective, how can I assess that with an athlete that he's above 90% of VO2 max? What would you use as an indice or data point?
Yeah, thanks, Cole, for a very nice question. In an earlier talk, we heard the huge discrepancies between times attained at, for example, above 90% VO2 max. It's not directly related to time spent above 90% heart rate. There are definitely differences. So I'm looking for a great study that basically says, like, okay, 90% VO2 max is at average around, for example, 95% maximum heart rate, or comparable, or the other way around, so that we have some indices like this. So I think in a practical way, having heart rate as an easy measurement is a great tool, and I do this myself recreationally. But we definitely have to have good research on how this translates. And if you take a look behind, there's definitely research from Acute for research is definitely a good partner for discussing this parameter.
One final question, please.
I suppose all the studies you present are studies where high-intensity interval will isolated sessions without overtraining sessions. But then I ask myself, if you said you have to go from laboratory size to applied size, should it not be more, should it not be better to give a certain training program, also with endurance training, and then specific interval training? Because I think for structural and functional adaptations, you need both. And that's what we are using. And all the studies, I make always the problem, there are always studies only high-intensity interval training, but you miss some adaptations, and especially the structural adaptations. If we want to set up a study design, I think you must set up something with endurance, for everybody the same, and you try to look at certain high-intensity interval training, what they are doing, because adaptations of high-intensity interval training will also be determined by physiological adaptations from endurance training.
Thank you very much for the comment. This is also something we discussed in the manuscript, so that not only the high-intensity sessions should be considered, but also the endurance sessions. Professor Steven Seiler, for example, discusses this always, so that in studies where you simply cut all the high volume, and we've heard this is the vast majority of the sessions performed at low intensity, if you have a time and zone approach especially. So this should definitely be meshed in a way, and then we have to discuss if you simply add the high intensity sessions towards the regular training, or what is the equivalent of like cutting, for example, 1 hour of low intensity for applying 2 HIIT sessions a week. And this should definitely be described in more detail, and not just the interval sessions. Thank you for the comment.
I'm sorry to stop this important discussion. Thank you.